3-year-old Emma clutched her mother's trembling hand as she entered the imposing courtroom in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, her tiny sneakers barely making a sound against the cold marble floors. The space felt impossibly large to a child accustomed to the cozy confines of her grandmother's kitchen and the soft safety of her bedroom. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the polished wooden benches like dark fingers reaching toward her. Emma's mother, Sarah, squeezed her daughter's hand with a mixture of love and desperation, silently communicating encouragement that she herself didn't fully feel. The weight of the moment pressed down on them both, a mother terrified that her child would have to relive the worst night of their lives, and a small girl who couldn't possibly understand why she was being asked to do something so frightening and foreign. Emma had witnessed something no child should ever see. 6 months earlier, on a warm summer evening, she had been playing in her grandmother's kitchen while her mother ran to the store. The window above the sink provided a view of the narrow alley behind the building, a space that usually held nothing more exciting than trash cans and the occasional neighborhood cat. That evening, however, the alley became the stage for a violent crime that would shatter the innocent tranquility of Emma's world forever. She had seen a man, a stranger with angry eyes and harsh movements, attacking her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived in the apartment across the alley. Emma didn't understand violence, didn't comprehend why someone would hurt another person, but her 3-year-old instincts recognized danger and chaos. The sounds had been terrible: shouting, struggling, the crash of something breaking. Emma had pressed her small face against the window glass, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, unable to look away from the horrible scene unfolding before her. The image had burned itself into her memory with the vividness that trauma imprints on the human brain, regardless of age. In the weeks following the incident, Emma had experienced nightmares that jolted her awake screaming in the darkness. She would call out for her mother, drenched in sweat, unable to articulate why she was so terrified. Sarah had rushed her to pediatric therapists and trauma specialists, who confirmed what she already knew. Her daughter had witnessed something that had fractured her sense of safety in the world. The bright, curious child who had once asked endless questions about butterflies and clouds had become withdrawn and anxious. Emma had developed a fear of windows, covering them with blankets. She startled at sudden movements and loud noises. She clung to her mother with a desperation that broke Sarah's heart daily. The therapists had warned that Emma needed to process what she'd seen, that suppressing the memory could lead to long-term psychological damage. The arrest had come 3 weeks after the crime. The perpetrator, a man named Marcus Webb, had been apprehended trying to flee Arizona. The evidence against him was substantial: physical evidence from the crime scene, eyewitness testimony from other neighbors, and the detailed account that Emma had given to police officers in the careful, child-friendly interview room at the police station. But now, 6 months later, Emma would have to tell her story again, this time in this enormous, terrifying space filled with people in dark suits who seemed to speak in a language she didn't understand. The courtroom felt like a monster to her, a creature with cold walls, stern faces, and an atmosphere heavy with consequence and judgment. Sarah had tried to prepare Emma as best she could. For weeks before the trial, they had visited the courthouse, walking Emma through the empty courtroom during off hours so she could become familiar with the space. They had explained in simple terms that there would be a judge, a person who decides important things, lawyers, people whose job was to ask questions, and a jury, regular people who would listen to what happened and decide if Marcus Webb was guilty. But no amount of preparation could truly ready a 3-year-old for the emotional and psychological ordeal of testifying about trauma. Emma had asked repeatedly, with the innocent logic of childhood, why she had to go back to that scary place. Why couldn't she just tell her mommy what she'd seen and have that be enough? The question had no satisfying answer, which Sarah had explained over and over with increasing frustration and sadness. Now, walking into the courtroom on the morning of her testimony, Emma felt the weight of invisible expectations pressing down on her small shoulders. The gallery was filled with spectators, journalists looking for their story, court officials preparing for the proceeding, and community members interested in the case. Emma's grandmother sat in the front row, her face etched with worry and determination. Sarah's parents flanked her, their hands ready to offer support the moment it was needed. But even surrounded by people who loved her, Emma felt profoundly alone in her fear. The marble floors echoed with footsteps that seemed to announce her arrival like a funeral march. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed too bright, casting harsh illumination on every detail of the courtroom's austere architecture. The judge, a man named Robert Harrison who had been on the bench for 23 years, looked down from his elevated position with an expression Emma found difficult to read. She couldn't tell if he was angry at her, angry at the situation, or simply maintaining the formal demeanor required of his position. His dark robe seemed to add to his authority and distance from Emma's world. The courtroom clerk swore Emma in, asking her to promise to tell the truth, and Emma nodded solemnly, though she didn't fully understand what oath-taking meant beyond the fact that it was serious and important. Adults always used serious voices when explaining serious things. Sarah found herself fighting back tears as she watched her daughter in the witness box. The chair had been adjusted to make it more comfortable for a child, but Emma still looked impossibly small, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. She wore her favorite dress, the one with the little flowers, though she seemed unaware of her own appearance. Her hair had been carefully braided that morning, a ritual Sarah had performed with shaking hands, knowing it would be one of the last acts of normalcy before everything became difficult again. Emma's thumb moved toward her mouth, a habit she developed after the trauma, and Sarah gently shook her head, reminding her daughter without words that she was a big girl now and didn't need that comfort. Emma's hand dropped back to her lap, and she sat with her small hands folded, looking like a miniature version of a witness bearing impossible burdens. Around the courtroom, lawyers shuffled papers with practiced efficiency. The prosecutor, Janet Rodriguez, was a woman in her mid-40s who had dedicated her career to protecting victims and seeking justice. She had carefully reviewed every piece of evidence and witness statement multiple times, preparing herself for the moment when a 3-year-old's testimony would determine the outcome of the case. Across from her, the defense attorney Robert Chen was equally experienced, his job being to ensure that his client received adequate representation regardless of the charges against him. The defendant himself, Marcus Webb, sat at the defense table looking simultaneously angry and detached, as if he existed in a different reality from everyone else in the courtroom. His eyes occasionally flicked toward Emma with an expression that made Sarah's protective instincts flare dangerously. Emma's heart pounded in her chest with such force that she worried the entire courtroom could see it through her thin chest. The noise of the courtroom was overwhelming, the scraping of chairs, the rustling of papers, the murmur of whispered conversations that seemed to carry accusatory undertones. The air felt thick and difficult to breathe. Emma found herself taking shallow breaths, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. Her mother had taught her a calming technique, counting to 5 while breathing in, holding for 5, breathing out for 5. But Emma's anxiety was so overwhelming that she couldn't remember the numbers. Everything felt wrong. The lighting was wrong. The temperature seemed to fluctuate between too cold and unbearably warm. The sounds were amplified to painful levels. Her skin felt prickly and uncomfortable in her favorite dress. The prosecutor would soon begin her questioning, walking Emma through the events of that terrible evening with carefully chosen words and gentle pauses for emotional processing. Emma knew that she was supposed to answer these questions, that it was important, that justice somehow depended on her ability to articulate what her 3-year-old mind had witnessed and struggled to make sense of. But in that moment before the questions began, Emma simply felt small, frightened, and utterly out of her depth in a world she didn't understand. She looked at her mother, searching for reassurance, but Sarah's own fear was barely contained beneath her composed exterior. The judge adjusted his glasses. The court reporter positioned her fingers over the stenotype machine. The attorneys exchanged glances that communicated years of courtroom experience and strategy. Emma took a shaky breath and waited for her ordeal to begin. She didn't know that in mere moments, a four-legged savior would enter this cold, frightening space and change everything. She didn't understand that her small voice, when combined with the right support and presence, would become powerful enough to shake the foundations of the justice system and inspire change that would ripple outward across an entire state. In that moment, she was simply a terrified 3-year-old girl about to be asked to relive the worst night of her young life, searching desperately for any source of comfort or safety in a courtroom that seemed designed to strip away all sense of security. The weight of the marble and steel around her felt like it was slowly pressing down, and she wondered, as only a frightened child can wonder, if she would survive what was about to happen. The prosecutor, Janet Rodriguez, rose from her seat with deliberate grace, her movements calculated to appear non-threatening to the terrified child sitting in the witness box. She was a woman of medium height with warm brown eyes that had learned to convey compassion even in the most adversarial environments. In her 20 years of practice, she had developed an almost instinctive understanding of how to communicate with young children without patronizing them, a delicate balance that most attorneys never mastered. Her navy blue suit was professional but not intimidating, and she had specifically chosen a softer blouse underneath rather than the starched white she usually wore. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated to present a non-threatening presence to Emma. She approached the witness box slowly, pausing several feet away so as not to tower over the small child. When she smiled, it was genuine. Janet had 3 children of her own, and she understood intuitively what it meant for a child to be placed in such a vulnerable position. "Hello, Emma," Janet began, her voice soft and warm, dropping several decibels from her normal courtroom tone. "My name is Ms. Rodriguez, and I'm going to ask you some questions about something that happened a long time ago. Is that okay with you?" Emma nodded slightly, her eyes still wide with anxiety. Janet had learned through experience that yes or no questions were often easier for children to process than open-ended inquiries. She pulled a chair closer to the witness box, positioning it at an angle so that she was at approximately eye level with Emma rather than looking down at her from above. This simple act of physical positioning communicated to Emma that they were having a conversation between 2 people, not an interrogation. The judge watched this interaction carefully, noting that Janet was following best practices for child testimony. He had attended several seminars on working with child witnesses and recognized the telltale signs of proper protocol. "Emma, I want to ask you about the night you were at your grandmother's house," Janet continued gently. "Do you remember that night, the night when you were playing in the kitchen?" Emma's lip trembled slightly, and she glanced toward her mother in the gallery. Sarah nodded encouragement, her own hands gripping the edge of the courtroom bench so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Emma's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, a sound so small that the courtroom reporter leaned forward slightly to ensure she captured every word correctly. "Yes," Emma breathed, the single word seeming to require enormous effort. "I remember." Janet paused, allowing the silence to settle for a moment. She knew from her training and experience that silence could be powerful. It gave children time to gather their thoughts and prevented the feeling of being rushed. "Tell me, Emma, what were you doing in the kitchen that night? What were you playing with?" This was a grounding question, designed to help Emma focus on concrete, non-threatening details before moving toward the traumatic elements. Emma's hands unclenched slightly, and she found herself able to talk about her toys, a plastic tea set that had belonged to her mother when she was young, some dolls that her grandmother kept in a special cabinet. As Emma spoke about these innocent details, her voice gained slightly more strength. She was able to describe the kitchen itself, the big refrigerator with pictures held up by magnets, the window above the sink where the sunlight came through in the afternoons. "That's good, Emma," Janet affirmed, her tone conveying genuine appreciation for these details. "You're doing really well. I can tell you have a very good memory." The compliment, though subtle, seemed to fortify Emma's confidence incrementally. Children, Janet knew, responded to positive reinforcement, and Emma needed to understand that sharing these memories was brave and worthwhile. "Now, Emma, while you were playing in the kitchen, were you looking out the window at all?" Emma's body stiffened visibly. Her small hand moved to her mouth again, and this time Sarah didn't correct her. The caseworker had explained that some self-soothing behaviors should be allowed during testimony, as preventing them could increase anxiety. "I saw the window," Emma said quietly. "There was the alley, I could see the alley." "Can you tell me what you saw in the alley, Emma?" Janet asked, her voice remaining gentle and patient. This was the threshold question. Once Emma crossed into describing the actual crime, there would be no returning to the safety of toy descriptions and kitchen details. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The defendant, Marcus Webb, straightened in his chair, his jaw clenching visibly. His attorney, Robert Chen, made a note on his legal pad, preparing his cross-examination strategy. The jury members, who had seemed somewhat distracted moments before, suddenly refocused their complete attention on the small girl in the witness box. Emma's voice cracked as she began to describe what she had witnessed. "There was a man," she said haltingly. He was hitting someone. There was a lady, and he was hitting her." As the words came out, Emma's small body seemed to physically respond to the trauma of recounting the violence. Her breathing became shallow. Her eyes began to well with tears, though she fought valiantly against actually crying, as if allowing herself to cry would somehow make the experience more real. Janet allowed the moment to breathe, not rushing Emma to continue. She had learned years ago that silence in these moments was sometimes more powerful than words. The courtroom reporter continued typing, capturing every word, every pause, every emotional nuance for the official record. "Where were you when you saw this happening?" Janet asked, guiding Emma toward more specific details while remaining sensitive to her emotional state. "I was at the window," Emma whispered. "Grandma's kitchen window. I could see the alley." Her small hands gripped the edge of the witness box, her knuckles turning white with the intensity of her grip. The man was very angry. He was making loud noises, scary noises. "Did you recognize the man, Emma? Had you seen him before?" Janet asked carefully. This was a crucial question. It would establish whether Emma could identify the perpetrator, which was essential for the prosecution's case. Emma shook her head slowly. "No, I never saw him before. He was not nice. His face was angry. His eyes were angry." She paused, and then added with the specific clarity that sometimes comes from children, "He looked mean." The prosecuting attorney nodded, acknowledging this observation. "Can you describe what this man looked like, Emma? What color was his hair? What was he wearing?" These questions were designed to establish whether Emma's description would match the defendant's appearance and clothing from that evening. Janet had reviewed the police photographs of Marcus Webb taken during his arrest, and she knew that Emma's descriptions would either corroborate or contradict the evidence the prosecution had gathered. "He had dark hair," Emma said, her voice strengthening slightly as she focused on concrete visual details. "And he had something on his arm, a dark picture on his arm." Her small finger pointed vaguely at her own arm, indicating where she had seen the tattoo. In the gallery, Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. The tattoo, the distinctive tattoo of a coiled snake that wrapped around Marcus Webb's left bicep, was something only an eyewitness could have known about. It hadn't been mentioned in any media coverage of the case. It was, in legal terms, a detail that significantly bolstered Emma's credibility. The courtroom began to shift energetically. Jurors who had been skeptical about relying on the testimony of a 3-year-old were reconsidering their initial doubts. The detail about the tattoo was too specific, too accurate to be coincidental or suggested. Janet allowed a small smile to cross her lips, though she maintained her professional demeanor. "You're doing such a good job describing what you saw, Emma," she said warmly. "That helps us understand what happened. Now, can you tell me what happened to the lady? What was she doing? Emma's description of Mrs. Chen's struggle became increasingly detailed and emotional. She described the sounds of the struggle, the way the woman had tried to get away, the way the man had grabbed her. As Emma spoke, her 3-year-old vocabulary struggled against the inadequacy of language to express violence and trauma. She used words like pushing and hitting and falling, painting a picture that, though simplified by a child's linguistic limitations, conveyed the brutal reality of what had occurred. Several jurors found themselves having to look away briefly, their own emotions stirred by the testimony of this small child describing adult violence. Several times during the testimony, Emma paused and requested water. A court officer brought her a small cup with a plastic lid and straw, a kindness that Janet had arranged beforehand. Emma drank gratefully, her hands shaking slightly as she held the cup. These breaks, though brief, allowed her nervous system to regulate somewhat before continuing. Judge Harrison watched these interactions carefully, ensuring that Emma was not being pushed beyond what was developmentally appropriate, while also understanding that some level of discomfort was inevitable and necessary for justice to be served. "Did you see what happened after the man was hitting the lady?" Janet asked, her tone remaining gentle. "Did you see where he went?" "He ran away," Emma said, her voice becoming smaller again. "He ran down the alley. He ran very fast, and the lady was on the ground. She was hurt. She was making sounds." Emma's description of Mrs. Chen's cries after the assault had been so clear, so vivid, that it seemed impossible that this child could be fabricating or confabulating these details. Janet had listened to the 911 call that Mrs. Chen herself had made, and Emma's description of the sounds aligned eerily well with what could be heard in the background of that call. "Emma, I know this is hard to talk about," Janet said, her voice thick with genuine compassion. "But I want to ask you, are you sure about what you saw? Could you be mixing this up with something else, like a movie or a dream?" This question was designed to address what she knew would be the defense's primary argument, that a 3-year-old's memory was unreliable and easily corrupted. By asking it herself, Janet was demonstrating that she had considered this possibility, and that Emma's answer still held weight and validity. "No," Emma said with unexpected firmness, her 3-year-old certainty cutting through the legal complexities like a knife. "It was real. It happened. I saw it." The prosecution continued questioning for another 40 minutes, building a comprehensive picture of what Emma had witnessed. With each answer, the portrait became more detailed, more specific, and more compelling. Emma described the weather that evening. It had been hot, and she remembered because her grandmother had turned on the air conditioning. She described what she had eaten for dinner that day, pasta with red sauce. She described the specific toys she had been playing with and where they were positioned on the kitchen counter. These seemingly mundane details, when woven together, created a tapestry of authenticity that suggested a genuine memory rather than a false one. Finally, Janet indicated that she had no further questions, and Emma's testimony under direct examination concluded. The small girl sat in the witness box, visibly exhausted by the emotional and cognitive labor of articulating trauma. Her mother looked ready to storm the bench and carry her daughter away from this cold, formal space. Judge Harrison announced a 15-minute recess before cross-examination would begin, a recess that both Emma and her mother desperately needed. As they led Emma out of the courtroom, she looked back once at the empty space where she would soon have to face the more aggressive questioning of the defense attorney, unaware that her ordeal was only just beginning. There you have it, a complete 1,000-word expansion of Part 3, capturing the nuances of child testimony, the prosecutor's strategic approach, Emma's emotional journey through the testimony, and the pivotal details that would shape the case. Would you like me to continue with another part? The recess ended too quickly for Emma's liking. She had spent the 15 minutes in a small room designated for witnesses, sipping juice through a bendy straw and sitting on her mother's lap, drawing pictures with colored pencils that a kind court officer had provided. Sarah had held her daughter tightly, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, that she was so proud of how brave Emma had been, that soon this would all be over. But both mother and daughter knew that the worst part was still to come. The defense attorney had his own job to do, and that job was to make Emma's testimony seem unreliable, to plant seeds of doubt in the jury's minds about whether a 3-year-old could accurately remember and articulate such serious matters. As they walked back into the courtroom, Emma's small hand gripped her mother's finger with desperate intensity, as if letting go might mean disappearing entirely into the cold marble and harsh fluorescent lighting. Robert Chen was a man of 53 years old with salt and pepper hair and an expression of calculated neutrality that had been perfected over 3 decades of criminal defense work. He had defended everyone from white-collar criminals to violent offenders, and he approached each case with the same methodical strategy: find the weaknesses in the prosecution's case and exploit them mercilessly. In this particular case, the weakness was obvious and glaring. The prosecution's primary witness was 3 years old. Chen understood child psychology better than most attorneys. He had taken extensive continuing education courses on the subject and had consulted with expert witnesses who specialized in childhood memory and suggestibility. He knew the research literature inside and out. Studies showing that children Emma's age were highly susceptible to leading questions, that their memories were malleable and easily influenced by authority figures, that they often confused details or invented elements to please adults who seemed to want certain answers. As Chen rose from his seat to begin cross-examination, he carried with him a folder containing academic studies, case law precedents, and expert reports that would form the foundation of his attack on Emma's credibility. He had carefully prepared his questions, each one designed to elicit responses that could later be characterized as uncertain, contradictory, or suspiciously convenient. His strategy was not to prove that Marcus Webb was innocent. The evidence was substantial and damaging regardless of Emma's testimony, but rather to create reasonable doubt about whether the jury should rely on the word of a child against the presumption of innocence that his client deserved. "Miss Emma," Chen began, his tone polite but carrying an undertone of skepticism that made Emma's mother tense visibly in the gallery. The use of Miss, rather than simply Emma, was deliberate. It was a subtle signal that Emma was a witness to be challenged rather than a child to be protected. "I have some questions for you about what you said you saw that night. Is that okay?" Emma nodded mutely, her eyes widening further if such a thing was possible. Chen positioned himself strategically, creating distance between himself and Emma but remaining in her line of sight, ensuring that every gesture and expression was visible to the jury. "Now, Emma, you told Ms. Rodriguez that you were playing with toys in the kitchen, correct?" Chen asked, his voice maintaining its polite, almost friendly tone. This opening question was innocuous, designed to lull Emma into a false sense of comfort before the real attack began. "Yes," Emma answered quietly. "And you said that you were looking out the window and saw a man hurting a lady in the alley. Is that right?" Again, a straightforward question designed to get Emma to reaffirm the central claim of her testimony. "Yes," Emma said again, though her voice had become even smaller. "Emma, I want to ask you something important," Chen said, leaning forward slightly with an expression of concerned intensity. "When you saw this man in the alley, how long did you see him? Was it for a long time or just for a little bit?" This question was designed to establish whether Emma had had sufficient time to form a reliable memory of the perpetrator's identity. Emma's small brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't know," she admitted, her honesty cutting against the prosecution's narrative. It was a little while, but I'm not sure how long." "Was it as long as it took to drink a glass of juice?" Chen asked, using a concrete metric that a 3-year-old could understand. "I don't know," Emma repeated, her uncertainty now evident in her response. In the gallery, the prosecution team exchanged worried glances. This was precisely the kind of uncertainty that defense attorneys thrived on. Chen continued with his questions, each one designed to highlight the limitations of a 3-year-old's perception and memory. "Emma, you said the man had dark hair, correct?" When Emma nodded, he continued, "How many men with dark hair have you seen in your life? Do you remember all of them?" "No," Emma answered, confused by the direction of the questioning. "So it's possible that you might see another man with dark hair and think it was the same man you saw in the alley, even though it wasn't correct?" Chen pressed, his question now taking on a leading quality that caused the judge to shift slightly in his seat, though he didn't interrupt. I don't know," Emma stammered, her confidence visibly crumbling under the weight of the attorney's sustained questioning. The technique Chen was employing was a well-documented psychological phenomenon. By asking leading questions that challenged Emma's certainty, he was actually creating doubt where there had been none before. Emma's 3-year-old mind, still developing its ability to stand firm in the face of adult authority figures, was beginning to question her own memories. "Let me ask you about something else," Chen said, shifting his line of attack. "You said you saw a picture on the man's arm. Can you describe that picture to me in detail?" Emma tried to describe the tattoo, but her limited vocabulary and visual spatial comprehension made her description vague and imprecise. She said it was dark and curly and on his arm, but she couldn't articulate the specific design of the coiled snake that the prosecution had presented in their evidence. Chen seized on this vagueness. "So really, you just saw something dark on his arm, but you're not entirely sure what it was, is that correct?" "It could have been a birthmark, or a bruise, or any number of things." "No, it was a picture," Emma insisted, though her voice had become uncertain. The prosecution objected, nodding that the attorney was argumentative and badgering, but the damage had already been done. The jurors had witnessed Emma's uncertainty, and that uncertainty was now lodged in their minds. Chen continued his cross-examination for nearly an hour, each question carefully calibrated to cast doubt on some aspect of Emma's testimony. He asked about the lighting in the alley. Could Emma really see clearly from the kitchen? He questioned what she had eaten that day, suggesting that if she misremembered lunch, how could she be trusted to remember something as serious as a violent crime? He asked about whether adults had discussed the crime with her, whether police officers or her mother or her grandmother had suggested certain details to her before she gave her formal statement. Each question carried the implicit message that Emma's testimony was unreliable, that her memory was malleable, that she was a child who couldn't possibly be expected to accurately recall and articulate something as complex as a crime. "Emma, when the police officers asked you about what you saw, did they ask you to describe the man, or did they show you pictures and ask you if that was the man you saw?" Chen asked, his question designed to establish whether Emma's identification had been the result of independent recollection or of being led toward a particular answer. I don't remember," Emma admitted, her eyes beginning to glisten with tears. She was becoming emotionally overwhelmed by the sustained attack on her credibility, and the courtroom was beginning to notice the toll it was taking. In the gallery, Sarah's hands had curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms so forcefully that small crescents of blood appeared where they had broken the skin. Her father's arm was around her shoulders, holding her in place, preventing her from standing up and demanding that the questioning stop. The caseworker who had been assigned to Emma's case was frantically taking notes, documenting what she would later describe in her report as a textbook example of aggressive cross-examination of a child witness. Judge Harrison watched the proceedings with an increasingly stern expression, but he was allowing the questioning to continue, understanding that the defense had a constitutional right to challenge the prosecution's evidence, even when that evidence came from a 3-year-old girl. "Emma, is it possible that you didn't actually see a man hurting a woman in the alley that night? Is it possible that you saw something else, or that someone told you a story about it, and now you think you remember seeing it yourself?" Chen asked, his question now venturing into territory that even some defense attorneys would consider ethically questionable. "No," Emma said, but her voice was barely audible, and her certainty had been thoroughly undermined by the sustained assault on her credibility. The defendant, Marcus Webb, sat at the defense table with a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. From his perspective, the cross-examination was going exactly as planned. The jury members who had been so moved by Emma's direct testimony were now exchanging skeptical glances. One juror, a man in his 60s who taught college courses, was nodding slightly as if confirming his own doubts about the reliability of child testimony. Another juror, a woman in her 40s who worked as a teacher, looked deeply uncomfortable, as if she was wrestling with conflicting emotions about the questioning. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so solid moments before, was beginning to show cracks in its foundation. "Let me ask you one more thing, Emma," Chen said, his voice taking on a tone of almost paternal concern that somehow made it more insidious. "Do you understand what it means to tell the truth?" "Yes," Emma whispered. "Can you explain to me what telling the truth means?" Chen pressed. Emma's lip trembled. It means saying what really happened." "And are you sure that's what you've been doing today? You're absolutely certain that you're telling me what really happened, not what someone told you happened or what you think might have happened?" Chen's question was designed to plant maximum doubt, to suggest that even Emma herself might not be certain of her own recollections. I think so," Emma said, and in those 4 words the prosecution felt their case beginning to unravel. When Chen finally indicated that he had no further questions, Emma was visibly traumatized. Her small frame seemed to have collapsed into itself, her earlier expressions of confidence and clarity replaced by confusion and uncertainty. As she was led out of the courtroom by her mother, she looked like a child who had been through a battle, because she had been, in a sense. The rules of evidence and the adversarial system had demanded that her testimony be rigorously challenged, and in the process, the integrity of that testimony had been significantly undermined. The prosecution called additional witnesses throughout the afternoon: the police officers who had investigated the scene, the forensic experts who had analyzed physical evidence, the neighbors who had heard the altercation. Each witness contributed pieces of corroborating evidence, but the damage had been done. Without Emma's clear, unequivocal testimony, each piece of evidence seemed slightly less conclusive, slightly more open to alternative interpretation. By the time the courtroom adjourned for the day, the atmosphere had shifted from the morning's sense of righteous momentum toward a more uncertain, divided energy. The prosecution had a problem, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. They had a compelling case, but their most crucial witness was a 3-year-old girl whose credibility had been systematically dismantled by a skilled defense attorney who understood precisely how to exploit the developmental limitations of childhood memory and perception. That evening, as Sarah held Emma close in their apartment, the child asked the question that broke her mother's heart. "Did I say it wrong, Mommy? The man said I was wrong. Did I get it wrong?" Sarah had no answer that could repair the damage, no words that could undo what had been done to her daughter's confidence in her own memory and perception of reality. The morning of the second day of testimony dawned gray and overcast in Phoenix, as if the weather itself was reflecting the emotional turmoil of the previous day's proceedings. Emma had not slept well. Sarah had found her daughter awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, her small body rigid with anxiety. Emma had asked repeatedly if she would have to go back to the courtroom, if the man would ask her more questions, if she had really gotten everything wrong. Sarah had held her daughter and promised that today would be different, though in her heart she wasn't certain what different would mean or whether she could deliver on that promise. The 2 of them had spent the early morning hours on the couch together, watching the sky gradually lighten, as the dread of the coming day settled over them both like a heavy blanket. The courtroom felt different when they arrived. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a palpable awareness among the legal professionals and court observers that something was about to happen, though no one could quite articulate what. The prosecutor, Janet Rodriguez, had spent much of the previous evening in her office, reviewing the case file and considering what options remained available to her. The defense had done exactly what it was designed to do: create reasonable doubt about the reliability of her primary witness. The evidence still supported the prosecution's narrative, but without Emma's clear, confident testimony to anchor that evidence in human reality, it felt abstract and incomplete. She had called the courthouse that morning to confirm that the comfort dog would indeed be present during this morning's proceedings, though the exact protocols for his involvement remained somewhat informal and fluid. Emma and her mother arrived at the courthouse an hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin. They went through the metal detectors and security procedures, familiar now after multiple visits. A victim advocate named Maria, a warm woman in her 50s who had been assigned to support Emma and her family throughout the trial, met them in the witness room. Maria had brought coloring books and crayons, snacks and juice boxes, and most importantly, a calm, reassuring presence that seemed to settle some of Emma's frayed nerves. Maria had been doing this work for 15 years, and she had developed an almost intuitive sense for when children were approaching their breaking points. She could see that Emma was there, hovering on the edge of complete psychological shutdown. The child needed something to anchor her, something to remind her that there were safe things in the world. "Emma, I have a surprise for you," Maria said gently, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "There's a very special dog that's going to be in the courtroom with you today. His name is Max, and he's a police dog who helps people feel brave. Would you like to meet him before we go into the courtroom?" Emma's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Dogs were not typically present in courtrooms, and the idea seemed both strange and somehow comforting. Sarah looked at Maria with gratitude, recognizing that this woman understood precisely what her daughter needed in this moment. They met Max in a small hallway outside the courtroom. The German Shepherd was accompanied by his handler, Officer James Patterson, a man in his early 40s who had been working with Max for 7 years. Max was a magnificent animal. His coat gleamed with health and careful grooming, his posture alert and dignified. But what struck Emma most immediately was the gentleness in his eyes. Max had been trained extensively in trauma response and victim support, and he seemed to understand instinctively that this small girl needed something from him. Officer Patterson brought Max closer, and the dog lowered his head slightly, allowing Emma to observe him without feeling intimidated by his size and strength. "You can pet him if you want," Officer Patterson said warmly. "Max likes children. He's going to stay near you while you answer questions today, okay? Whenever you feel scared or sad, you can look at Max, and he'll be right there with you." Emma's small hand extended hesitantly, and her fingers made contact with Max's fur. The sensation was surprisingly comforting, warm and alive, and real in a way that nothing else in the cold courtroom seemed to be. Max remained absolutely still, allowing the frightened child to draw whatever comfort she needed from his presence. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched her daughter's shoulders relax slightly, the first sign of genuine relief she'd seen since this ordeal began. As they entered the courtroom, Max walked beside Emma, his massive frame somehow making her small presence seem less insignificant, less overwhelmed by the formal architecture and stern faces surrounding her. Officer Patterson positioned Max on a comfortable mat positioned near the witness box, close enough for Emma to see him clearly, but positioned so as not to obstruct the jury's view of the witness. The judge, who had been briefed about the comfort dog's presence, nodded his approval. Even Robert Chen, the defense attorney, made no objection, understanding that challenging the presence of the dog would make him appear cruel and unsympathetic to the jury. Emma climbed back into the witness box with slightly more confidence than she'd had the previous day. But as the prosecutor began her redirect examination, the process of allowing the prosecution to rehabilitate its witness after cross-examination, Emma's anxiety still threatened to overwhelm her. Janet Rodriguez asked her to recount certain details that had been challenged during cross-examination, trying to restore confidence in Emma's recollections. Emma's answers came slowly, hesitantly. She still seemed uncertain, still seemed to doubt her own memory. Then came a moment that would later be analyzed and discussed in law review articles and courtroom training seminars across the country. The defense attorney, pressing forward with his strategy of creating doubt, was mid-sentence, asking Emma another leading question designed to suggest that her memory was unreliable. "Isn't it true, Emma, that children your age often confuse what they've seen with what adults have told them they've seen? Isn't it true that you can't really be sure anymore what you actually remember versus what someone suggested to you?" Chen was asking, his voice carrying that undertone of aggressive skepticism that had served him so well the previous day. But as Chen spoke, something shifted in Emma's awareness. Her eyes, which had been darting nervously around the courtroom, suddenly focused on Max. The dog, sensing the child's distress, had lifted his head and turned his full attention toward her. His gaze was unwavering, non-judgmental, utterly free of the complexity and accusation that characterized the human gazes surrounding her. In Max's eyes, Emma saw no doubt, no suspicion, no attempt to convince her that her own perceptions were wrong. What she saw was simple, profound acceptance and a kind of witnessing presence that seemed to say, "You are safe, your feelings are valid, there is good in this world." In that moment of connection with the dog, something crystallized in Emma's consciousness. The confusion that Chen had spent so much effort creating began to dissolve. Emma realized, in the way that 3-year-olds sometimes demonstrate an almost preternatural wisdom, that there was a difference between the man who had hurt the lady and this dog who was protecting her. There was a difference between danger and safety, between deception and truth, between someone trying to convince her she was wrong and someone who simply believed in her. The profound difference between good and evil, which Chen had been trying to obscure with his questions, suddenly became clear again. Emma's small arm rose, her finger pointing directly at Max with the absolute certainty of a child who had just glimpsed an essential truth. And in a voice that seemed to cut through every layer of legal argument and psychological manipulation, a voice that carried the weight of unambiguous reality, Emma spoke 2 words that would echo through the courtroom and eventually through the entire Arizona legal system. "Good dog." The courtroom erupted in stunned silence, not the kind of silence that follows a dramatic moment in a movie, but a real, profound silence. The silence of a room full of people who have just witnessed something unexpected and transformative. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keyboard. The judge leaned forward, his expression shifting from judicial neutrality to something more human. The jury members, who had been maintaining their carefully neutral expressions, found themselves unable to control their facial reactions. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. Others exchanged glances that communicated a sudden shift in perspective. Robert Chen's face flushed. He had prepared for many possible responses from Emma, but not this. Not this simple statement directed at a dog, made with such absolute clarity and conviction that it seemed to communicate something far deeper than its surface meaning. The defense attorney attempted to recover, to continue with his questioning, but the moment had shifted irrevocably. Something fundamental had changed in the courtroom's energy. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, covering a sob of relief and profound emotion. In that moment, watching her daughter point at the dog and declare its goodness with such certainty, Sarah understood that Emma's fear-clouded, doubt-filled confusion of the previous day had been lifted. The child had found her ground again, her ability to distinguish between threat and safety, between the person trying to manipulate her and the presence that supported her. Emma's gaze returned to the questioning adult, but something had fundamentally shifted in her demeanor. She sat taller in the witness box. Her voice, when she spoke next, carried a new strength and clarity that hadn't been present before. When the prosecutor asked her to reaffirm certain details about that night 6 months ago, Emma answered with the directness and specificity that had characterized her direct testimony before the brutal cross-examination. "I saw the man," Emma said clearly. "He was hitting the lady. I saw his face. I saw his arm. It was real. It really happened." The words came with renewed certainty. This time, when Chen attempted to suggest that Emma's memory might be confused or influenced, Emma did not waver. She had found something more powerful than legal argument or psychological suggestion. She had found the simple, unambiguous difference between good and evil, and Max had been the mirror in which she could see that difference clearly. The defense attorney's subsequent questions fell flat. Emma's answers were brief, confident, and devastatingly clear. She was no longer a traumatized child being manipulated by skilled questioning. She was a witness who had reconnected with her own perception of truth. The jury watched this transformation with profound attention. Several jurors began making notes that had less to do with legal arguments and more to do with their own internal processing of what they were witnessing. By the time Chen concluded his cross-examination, the damage to the prosecution's case had been substantially reversed. Emma had been rehabilitated not by legal maneuvering or expert testimony, but by the simple presence of a dog who had reminded her that goodness existed, that safety was real, and that her own perception of reality, the perception that distinguished between a dangerous person and a protective presence, could be trusted absolutely. As Emma was finally excused from the witness box, she looked directly at Max, and the dog's tail wagged once, a subtle acknowledgement of the profound work they had accomplished together. Officer Patterson guided Max toward Emma, and for just a moment the child was able to wrap her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur. It was a moment of pure healing, of a child reclaiming her sense of safety and truth after it had been systematically attacked and undermined. In that embrace, Emma seemed to shed some of the trauma that had accumulated over the previous 2 days, replacing it with a kind of resilience that would shape her healing journey in the months and years to come. The courtroom seemed to breathe differently after Emma's 2 words resonated through its vast space. It was as if a fundamental shift had occurred in the room's atmosphere, not a dramatic, sudden change, but rather a slow, inevitable recognition that the narrative had fundamentally altered. The prosecution team felt it first, a subtle lifting of the weight that had been pressing down on them since the brutal cross-examination of the previous day. Janet Rodriguez sat at the prosecution table with her notepad, her fingers poised over her pen, acutely aware that the moment of her redirect examination had arrived. This was her opportunity to rehabilitate Emma's testimony, to help the jury understand that the child's memory was intact, that the confusion and doubt planted by the defense attorney were artifacts of manipulation rather than reflections of reality. But something had shifted within Emma herself, something that went beyond the strategic maneuvering of courtroom examination and cross-examination. Having made contact with Max's presence, having pointed toward him with the absolute certainty of a child who recognizes the difference between good and evil, Emma seemed to have accessed a wellspring of clarity that had been buried beneath layers of trauma and fear. Her small body, which had been curled inward with anxiety just moments before, now sat slightly straighter. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid throughout the previous day's testimony, had slowed and deepened. Her eyes, which had been darting nervously from face to face, seeking reassurance and safety, now focused with greater steadiness on the adults who were asking her questions. Janet Rodriguez rose from her seat and approached the witness box with a sense of cautious optimism. She had been in the courtroom long enough to recognize transformative moments, and she understood that something meaningful had just occurred. But she also understood that the jury needed more than a moment. They needed substance, corroboration, and the kind of detailed recollection that would withstand legal scrutiny. She positioned herself at a slight angle to the witness box, maintaining the gentle, non-threatening posture that had characterized her approach throughout Emma's testimony. "Emma, I want to ask you again about the man you saw in the alley," Janet began, her voice warm but purposeful. "When you looked out that window and you saw this man, The man who was hurting the lady. Can you tell me again what he looked like? Take your time and tell me everything you remember." This was a classic redirect examination technique, allowing the witness to provide a fresh narrative after the defense had attempted to undermine their recollection through leading questions and suggestions. But this time, something was different in the way Emma responded. "He had dark hair," Emma said, her voice carrying more strength than it had possessed the previous day. "And his face was angry, very angry. His eyes were mean, like he was mad at the lady." Emma paused and then continued with a specificity that made the prosecution's heart rate accelerate. "He had something on his arm, a dark thing. It was like a snake. It was curled around like this." Emma made a circular motion with her small hand, indicating the coiled pattern of the tattoo. "And he was wearing a white shirt, and it was torn. The lady tore it when she was fighting." The detail about the torn shirt was something that hadn't been prominently featured in the prosecution's previous questioning. The forensic evidence included photographs of the defendant's clothing from the night of his arrest, which showed a torn white t-shirt consistent with the kind of struggle Mrs. Chen had described. But the fact that Emma had independently recalled this detail, without any leading question from the prosecution, was profoundly powerful evidence that she possessed a genuine memory of the crime scene rather than a constructed or suggested recollection. The jury members who had begun to doubt Emma's testimony the previous day found themselves reconsidering their initial skepticism. A woman in the front row of the jury box, a middle-aged schoolteacher, was leaning forward with an expression of intense focus. A man in the back, a construction foreman, was nodding slightly, as if confirming something to himself. The shift was palpable, measurable, as if the collective psychological weight of the jury was gradually repositioning itself back toward belief in Emma's account. "Tell me about the lady," Janet continued, guiding Emma to describe Mrs. Chen's experience of the assault. "What do you remember about what happened to her?" Emma's small face scrunched with the effort of translation, of converting visual memory into verbal description. "She was trying to get away," Emma said, her voice filled with the emotional resonance of having witnessed genuine danger. "The man was grabbing her, and she was saying no, no, no. She was very scared. I could hear her being scared. And then he was hitting her and she was trying to block it with her arms." Emma demonstrated with her own small arms, raising them defensively as if to shield herself. "And she fell down. She fell and hit the ground and she was crying. She was making sounds like she was hurt." Janet allowed the moment to settle. She didn't immediately ask another question. Instead, she simply allowed Emma's words to resonate through the courtroom, allowing the jury to absorb the weight of what they were hearing. This was a child describing, in her own limited vocabulary and with her own limited understanding of adult violence, an act of genuine brutality that she had witnessed with her own eyes. The emotional authenticity of her description was almost impossible to refute. "Emma, yesterday when Mr. Chen asked you questions, he suggested that maybe you weren't really sure about what you saw. He suggested that maybe you were confused or that someone had told you what happened. Do you remember him asking you those questions?" Janet asked carefully, her tone suggesting no criticism of Emma, but rather a gentle acknowledgement of the difficult experience she had endured. "Yes," Emma said quietly. "He said I wasn't sure. He said I might be wrong." "And now, having had time to think about it, having seen Max the dog, do you feel more sure or less sure about what you saw that night in the alley?" Janet asked, her question carefully designed to allow Emma to articulate her own sense of whether her memory had been restored or further undermined. Emma looked toward Max, who was watching her with unwavering attention from his mat nearby. "I'm more sure," Emma said with a clarity and conviction that seemed to have emerged from somewhere deeper than her 3-year-old consciousness. "I know what I saw. I really know. The man was bad. He hurt the lady. I saw it." In the defendant's section of the courtroom, Marcus Webb's expression shifted. The confidence that had characterized his demeanor during the previous day's testimony, when it seemed that the defense strategy was successfully discrediting the prosecution's case, began to crack. Webb was no fool. He understood that the momentum had reversed. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something urgently, his jaw clenched with barely suppressed rage. Robert Chen's expression hardened, and he began making notes on his legal pad with more forceful pressure than was strictly necessary. Janet continued with her redirect examination, asking Emma to recount specific details that had been challenged during cross-examination. With each answer, Emma's confidence seemed to grow. She described the specific way the man had moved, the violence of his actions, the terror in Mrs. Chen's voice. She recalled small details that had not been part of the initial questioning. The sound of gravel crunching under their feet as they struggled, the way the afternoon sun had been casting long shadows in the alley, the smell that was different from normal, a sharp, acrid smell that Emma now understood was likely adrenaline and violence, though she couldn't have named it as such. The prosecution presented a series of leading questions designed not to suggest answers, but to confirm details that Emma had already articulated. "You said the man was wearing a white shirt that was torn. Do you remember what part of the shirt was torn?" Janet asked, referring to her notes. "The sleeve," Emma said without hesitation. "The right sleeve. It was ripped right here." She pointed to her own right shoulder, demonstrating the location with the kind of physical specificity that suggested genuine visual memory. The forensic photographs that had been introduced into evidence showed, indeed, that the right sleeve of the defendant's shirt bore evidence of tearing consistent with the kind of struggle Mrs. Chen had described. Emma's independent recall of this detail, without any prompting from the prosecution, served as powerful corroboration of her overall credibility as a witness. As the redirect examination continued, something remarkable occurred. The defense's strategy of undermining Emma's testimony through leading questions and suggestions of unreliability began to unravel in the light of her renewed clarity and specificity. With each answer she provided, Emma seemed to be not only recalling details, but also rebuilding her own confidence in her memory. The psychological damage that had been inflicted during the brutal cross-examination was being systematically repaired, not through argument or expert testimony, but through the simple process of allowing Emma to re-establish her connection with her own truth. When Janet asked Emma about the perpetrator's distinctive tattoo one more time, the child's description became more specific and vivid. "It was like a snake that was going around and around," Emma said, making a circular motion with her finger. "And it had a head, and the head was right here on his arm." She pointed to the location on her own arm where the snake's head would be positioned. "It was dark, like black or dark green, and it made his arm look scary, like a snake could bite you. But the man was scarier than the snake." The psychological observation contained within that statement, that the man himself was scarier than the image on his arm, demonstrated a level of perception and discernment that suggested Emma's memory was not only intact, but also emotionally calibrated to the reality of what she had witnessed. She wasn't simply reciting details. She was describing a genuine experience processed through a 3-year-old's consciousness. The prosecution called its next witness, Detective Sarah Martinez, the investigator who had interviewed Emma in the days following the crime. Martinez testified that Emma had provided consistent descriptions of the perpetrator throughout their multiple interviews, that the details had not changed significantly, and that Emma had resisted all attempts by the detective to suggest particular details or answer leading questions. The detective explained that she had been trained in child interview techniques and had deliberately asked open-ended questions to avoid the very kind of suggestibility that the defense had implied might have corrupted Emma's memory. When cross-examined, Detective Martinez stood her ground. "In my professional opinion, having conducted over 500 interviews with child witnesses, Emma's recall demonstrated the hallmarks of genuine memory rather than suggested or confabulated details," the detective stated firmly. She resisted leading questions. She provided details that were not previously mentioned, and her descriptions have remained consistent across multiple interviews separated by significant time periods. The prosecution's case, which had seemed to be crumbling under the defense's assault, began to reconstitute itself. Additional witnesses testified to details that corroborated Emma's account. A forensic technician explained the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene and how it aligned with Emma's description of the struggle. The neighbor who had found Mrs. Chen in the alley testified that he had heard sounds consistent with what Emma had described: the struggling, the violence, the cries of distress. By the afternoon of that second day, the courtroom's atmosphere had undergone a fundamental transformation. The jury members who had been skeptical that morning were now attentive and engaged, taking notes and exchanging meaningful glances that suggested they were processing the evidence with renewed belief in its validity. The defense's strategy of attacking Emma's credibility had backfired. By pressing so hard, by asking so many leading questions designed to create doubt, Chen had inadvertently allowed Emma to clarify and deepen her own recollection once the pressure was removed. As the day concluded, Judge Harrison adjourned proceedings, and Emma was finally able to leave the witness box for the last time. Officer Patterson brought Max closer to Emma, and the dog pressed his large head gently against the child's small body. Emma wrapped her arms around Max's neck and whispered something into his ear, words that no one else could hear, but that seemed to communicate a profound gratitude and connection. Max's tail wagged slowly, and in that moment, it was clear to everyone observing that something extraordinary had occurred. A traumatized child had been healed through the presence of an animal, and her healed consciousness had transformed the entire trajectory of a criminal prosecution. The unraveling of the defense's deception strategy had been gradual but complete, and it had been orchestrated not by legal arguments or expert testimony, but by the simple, profound power of a child reconnecting with her own truth in the presence of unconditional acceptance and safety. The jury deliberation room was a space designed for careful consideration and thoughtful analysis, though the reality of jury deliberations often fell short of this noble ideal. On the morning of the third day of jury proceedings, 12 ordinary citizens, a mix of teachers, construction workers, retirees, business owners, and service industry employees, filed into the windowless room carrying with them the weight of a consequential decision. The bailiff had handed each juror a packet containing jury instructions, evidence summaries, and the specific charges against Marcus Webb. Felony assault with intent to cause serious bodily injury, assault resulting in substantial risk of death, and a weapons enhancement charge related to a knife that had been recovered from the crime scene with the defendant's fingerprints. The foreman, a retired accountant named Robert Hayes, called the room to order with the kind of gravitas that suggested he understood the profound responsibility they all carried. "Before we begin," Hayes said, looking around the table at his fellow jurors, "I think we should all acknowledge what we witnessed over the past 3 days. A child testified about witnessing a violent crime. That child was subjected to rigorous cross-examination designed to undermine her credibility. And then, something unexpected happened that changed the entire nature of how we understand her testimony." The jury members exchanged glances, many of them nodding in acknowledgement of what they had collectively experienced. A woman named Patricia, a middle school teacher who had been particularly moved by Emma's testimony, spoke up immediately. "That moment when she pointed at the dog and said, 'Good dog,' I don't think I'll ever forget that," Patricia said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. It was like she was suddenly able to distinguish between someone trying to trick her and someone who was genuinely safe." Another juror, a man named Derek who worked in construction and had initially been skeptical about relying on a child's testimony, nodded slowly. "At first, when that defense attorney was questioning her yesterday morning, I thought there was no way we could base a conviction on what a 3-year-old said. She seemed so confused, so uncertain. But after she saw that dog, it was like a different child was testifying. She wasn't confused anymore. She knew what she saw." The jury room fell into a thoughtful silence as the jurors contemplated the psychological transformation they had witnessed. The judge's instructions had been clear. They were to base their verdict solely on the evidence presented and the law as explained by the judge. But the judge was also human enough to understand that witnessing Emma's testimony, particularly that pivotal moment with Max, would inevitably influence how the jurors evaluated all the other evidence in the case. As the deliberation progressed, the jurors systematically reviewed each piece of evidence. The forensic evidence was substantial: fingerprints belonging to Marcus Webb on the knife that had been used in the assault, fiber evidence connecting Webb's clothing to the crime scene, and DNA evidence recovered from under Mrs. Chen's fingernails, consistent with Webb's genetic profile, indicating that she had scratched him during their struggle. This physical evidence, standing alone, created a powerful case for conviction. But it was Emma's testimony, now rehabilitated and clarified, that gave human reality to the physical evidence. The torn white shirt that she had described matched the clothing Webb had been wearing when arrested. The distinctive tattoo that she had identified as being a coiled snake was indeed a snake tattoo covering much of Webb's left bicep, a tattoo so distinctive that it would be virtually impossible for Emma to have described it accurately without having actually seen it. The way Emma had described the struggle, the specific details about Mrs. Chen fighting back, about the sounds of violence, about the desperate nature of the attack, aligned perfectly with Mrs. Chen's own testimony and the physical injuries she had sustained. "I think the critical point is this," Patricia said during a moment of deeper deliberation. Emma's description of events was so specific, so detailed, and so consistent with all the other evidence that she couldn't possibly have been making it up or confabulating. She described things that no one could have suggested to her because no one knew about them until she mentioned them. A retired librarian named Helen added her perspective, and we have to remember that this child went through an intense cross-examination designed by a skilled attorney to make her seem unreliable. If she had been making things up, that cross-examination would have exposed the inconsistencies. Instead, when she had that moment of clarity with the dog, her testimony became even more detailed and specific. That's not how false memories work. The jury deliberation moved methodically through each charge against Marcus Webb. For the first charge, felony assault with intent to cause serious bodily injury, the evidence was overwhelming. Mrs. Chen had sustained injuries consistent with deliberate, violent attack. The assault had caused her to lose consciousness, and she had required hospitalization for her injuries. Emma had described the violence in graphic terms appropriate to a child's vocabulary. The physical evidence corroborated every element of the crime as alleged. "This is not a close case," Derek said, his earlier skepticism about Emma's testimony now completely dissipated. "We have a knife with his fingerprints on it. We have his DNA under the victim's fingernails. We have fiber evidence. We have the victim's testimony. We have a child's eyewitness account that is held up under the most rigorous scrutiny. And we have the defendant's own behavior. He fled the state immediately after the crime. That's consciousness of guilt." For the second charge, assault resulting in substantial risk of death, the jury had to determine whether the attack was severe enough to constitute a life-threatening assault. Mrs. Chen's injuries had included a serious stab wound to the chest that had narrowly missed her heart by approximately 1 centimeter. A trauma surgeon who had testified for the prosecution had explained that the wound was, in medical terms, remarkably close to a fatal injury. Had the knife entered at a slightly different angle, had the victim's movement during the struggle shifted the point of impact by a small distance, Mrs. Chen would almost certainly have died. "I've been thinking about Emma's description of how afraid she was," Helen said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "She said the lady was making sounds like she was hurt and scared. A 3-year-old was witnessing an attempt on someone's life, and she understood that something terrible was happening. That attack was absolutely serious enough to constitute a risk of death." The weapons enhancement charge was the most straightforward. The knife recovered from the crime scene bore Marcus Webb's fingerprints, and he had used that knife in the commission of the assault. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The deliberation took 6 hours. For much of that time, the jurors were in substantial agreement about the defendant's guilt, but jury procedure required that they discuss, analyze, and come to consensus on each charge individually. They reviewed the judge's instructions repeatedly, ensuring that they were applying the correct legal standards. They discussed the burden of proof, that the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and they came to the unanimous conclusion that the evidence in this case exceeded that burden by a substantial margin. As the afternoon wore on, Judge Harrison sent a note asking whether the jury had reached verdicts. The bailiff returned with word that they had. At 4:47 p.m. on the afternoon of the third day of jury proceedings, the jury filed back into the courtroom to announce their decisions. Emma was not present for the verdict. The prosecutors had decided that the child had endured enough courtroom trauma, and that having her present for the verdict was unnecessary and potentially further damaging. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman, Robert Hayes, stood and faced the judge. The clerk of the court asked the traditional question, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Hayes answered in the affirmative, and the bailiff collected the verdict forms. The judge opened the envelopes containing the jury's decisions and read them silently, his expression remaining carefully neutral. The defendant, Marcus Webb, sat motionless at the defense table, his face a mask of controlled tension. The judge handed the verdict forms back to the clerk, who stood to read them aloud. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. On the charge of felony assault with intent to cause serious bodily injury, we, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Webb guilty. The word guilty hung in the air. In the gallery, Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Mrs. Chen, the victim, closed her eyes and allowed tears to stream down her face. The prosecution team exchanged glances that mixed relief with the knowledge that justice, real justice, had been served. On the charge of assault resulting in substantial risk of death, we, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Webb guilty. On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, we, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Webb guilty. The verdicts came one after another, each one a statement by the jury that they had considered the evidence. They had evaluated the credibility of the witnesses, including a traumatized 3-year-old girl who had found her voice with the help of a dog, and they had determined, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Marcus Webb was guilty of the crimes charged. Marcus Webb's face flushed with rage, and he half rose from his seat before his attorney pulled him back down. The defendant's moment of triumph, the moment when it had seemed that the defense's aggressive cross-examination of Emma might actually succeed in creating reasonable doubt, was now definitively over. The jury had seen through the legal maneuvering. They had recognized the truth that Emma's testimony embodied, and they had acted on that recognition. In the courtroom gallery, members of the prosecution team embraced. Reporters began frantically typing messages to their news desks. The judge's expression shifted from judicial neutrality to something approaching satisfaction. Judge Harrison had presided over hundreds of criminal trials, and he understood that this verdict represented not just the application of legal rules, but a deeper justice, the recognition that a child's testimony, when supported by physical evidence and corroborating witnesses, had the power to hold a dangerous person accountable. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks hence, allowing time for presentence investigations and victim impact statements to be prepared. As the courtroom emptied, the prosecution team remained behind, collecting their materials and exchanging quiet words of satisfaction and relief. The case that had seemed in jeopardy after the brutal cross-examination of Emma had not only survived, but had emerged stronger. The jury had seen past the legal strategy, past the attack on credibility, past all the sophisticated mechanisms of the adversarial system, and had recognized the fundamental truth that a traumatized child had articulated through her testimony. Some things were simply good, some things were simply dangerous, and the difference between them mattered. Later that evening, when Sarah told Emma that the jury had found the bad man guilty, Emma's response was simple and profound. "Good dog helped me tell the truth," she said, remembering Max and the moment when his presence had allowed her to reconnect with her own certainty. The verdict represented the turning point not just in the trial, but in the healing process that would characterize Emma's recovery from trauma. The system had worked, not because of legal brilliance or courtroom strategy, but because a child had been given the support she needed to speak truth, and a jury had been willing to listen. The day of sentencing arrived 3 weeks later, carrying with it the weight of finality and the promise of closure. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Phoenix courthouse with unusual brilliance, as if the weather itself was acknowledging the significance of what was about to transpire. Emma had asked her mother repeatedly in the days leading up to the sentencing if she would have to testify again, if she would have to face more questions, if the experience would be as terrifying as before. Sarah had reassured her daughter that this would be different, that today, Emma would be there not as a witness subjected to examination, but as a small girl who had been brave enough to speak truth, and that her presence would help the judge understand the full impact of the crime that had been committed. Emma wore the same pink dress she had worn on the day of sentencing, the one her mother had carefully washed and pressed, treating it almost as a ceremonial garment. Her hair had been braided again with the same care and intention that Sarah had brought to every interaction with her daughter since the trial concluded. 3 weeks had passed since the verdict, and in that time, Emma had begun the slow process of healing. The nightmares had become less frequent, occurring perhaps 2 or 3 times a week rather than nightly. She had begun to sleep with her bedroom door open again, a small but significant step toward reclaiming her sense of safety in her own home. The therapist who had been working with Emma reported that the child was showing signs of genuine recovery, though she cautioned that the trauma would likely continue to influence Emma's development and psychology in subtle ways for years to come. Officer James Patterson had called Sarah the day before sentencing to confirm that Max would be present for the proceeding. Max had become something of a minor celebrity in the Arizona legal system. Following the trial's conclusion, the story of the 3-year-old girl who had found her voice through the presence of a comfort dog had been featured in numerous news outlets. Legal scholars had begun publishing articles about the case, analyzing the psychological dynamics that had allowed Emma's testimony to be rehabilitated through the dog's presence. Universities had contacted Officer Patterson about developing training programs for comfort animals in court settings. The case had become a turning point in how the legal system thought about supporting traumatized child witnesses. Emma and her mother arrived at the courthouse early. The security screening process had become familiar by now, the metal detectors, the X-ray machines, the polite but thorough searches. They made their way to the witness preparation room, where Maria, the victim advocate, greeted them with warm embraces. Maria had been following Emma's recovery closely, checking in with Sarah regularly to ensure that the child was receiving adequate support. Maria had become something of a grandmother figure to Emma, bringing small gifts, coloring books, stickers, a stuffed animal that Emma carried with her everywhere now. "Max is waiting for you," Maria said to Emma, her voice conveying special knowledge. "He was very excited to see you today. He's been practicing his very best behavior because this is an important day." Emma's eyes widened with delight at the prospect of seeing her 4-legged friend again. The connection between Emma and Max had not diminished in the weeks since the trial. If anything, it had deepened. Emma had drawn dozens of pictures of Max, crude, colorful representations of a German shepherd that hung throughout her and Sarah's apartment. She talked about Max constantly, and Sarah had begun making inquiries about possibly getting a dog of their own, understanding that Emma's bond with Max represented something therapeutic and healing that transcended normal pet ownership. They met Max in the hallway outside the courtroom. The German Shepherd's entire body seemed to wag with pleasure at seeing Emma again. Officer Patterson brought the dog lower, allowing Emma to wrap her arms around Max's neck. The embrace was longer this time, more secure and less desperate than it had been during the trial testimony. Emma whispered something into Max's ear, words that Officer Patterson couldn't quite hear, but that seemed to communicate gratitude and affection. Max responded by licking Emma's face, and the child giggled, a genuine, joyful sound that had been rare in the months since the crime. The courtroom was more crowded than it had been during the trial. Word of the verdict had spread, and community members, advocates for victims' rights, and observers interested in the legal precedent the case had established filled the gallery. Mrs. Chen, the victim, sat in the front row with her family. She had recovered significantly from her physical injuries, though the psychological trauma of the assault would continue to affect her for years to come. She had requested time to give a victim impact statement, and she had spent weeks preparing it, wanting to ensure that her words would accurately convey not only her own suffering, but also the gratitude she felt toward Emma for her bravery in testifying. The defendant, Marcus Webb, was brought into the courtroom in custody. He wore an orange jumpsuit and was shackled at the ankles and wrists, a visual representation of the loss of freedom that had already begun to define his future. Webb's face was harder than it had been during the trial, as if the reality of his conviction had calcified something in his expression. His attorney, Robert Chen, sat beside him, though the appeal process would likely consume much of the next several years of both men's professional lives. Chen had already begun laying the groundwork for appeals, claiming that certain rulings by the judge had been improper and that the admission of Emma's testimony, particularly given her age, should be revisited on appeal. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with the same formal dignity he had maintained throughout the proceedings. He took his place at the bench and nodded to the clerk to begin the proceedings. The judge had received numerous letters from mental health professionals, legal scholars, and victim advocates, many of them requesting that he impose the maximum possible sentence on Marcus Webb. The judge had also received communications from Webb's family, pleading for leniency based on Webb's difficult childhood and his lack of prior criminal convictions. The first portion of the sentencing hearing was dedicated to victim impact statements. Mrs. Chen rose from her seat with visible effort, her body still bearing the physical consequences of the assault. She approached the podium and looked directly at Marcus Webb before beginning to speak. "On that night 6 months ago, you took from me my sense of safety," Mrs. Chen began, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly present beneath her words. "You took from me my sense of security in my own community, in my own home. You took from me the person I was before this assault. That person is gone, and I'm still trying to figure out who I am now." She paused, gathering her strength. "But I want to tell you about something you did not take from me. You did not take my will to survive, my determination to see justice served, and my gratitude for a small girl who was brave enough to tell the truth about what you did." Mrs. Chen turned to look at Emma, who sat with her mother in the gallery, holding Max's leash. That child witnessed violence that no child should ever have to see. She was terrified. She was confused and manipulated during cross-examination. But she found her courage and she told the truth, and because of her, you are being held accountable for what you did. For that, I am eternally grateful. The victim impact statement lasted nearly 20 minutes. When Mrs. Chen concluded, there were few dry eyes in the courtroom. Judge Harrison allowed a moment of silence before indicating that the next speaker could proceed. Several community members spoke, describing how the crime had affected the neighborhood and how the trial's resolution had restored some sense of safety to the community. Then it came time for the judge to speak. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, a deliberate gesture that suggested he was about to say something of profound importance. When he put the glasses back on and looked directly at Marcus Webb, his expression conveyed the weight of judicial authority and moral judgment. "Marcus Webb, You have been found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of serious crimes against another human being, the judge began, his voice carrying through the courtroom with measured gravity. This assault was brutal, vicious, and ultimately motivated by anger and a desire to dominate another person. The victim of your crime is here today, and her impact statement speaks to the devastating consequences of your actions. The judge paused, and his gaze shifted slightly to include Emma in his field of vision. What is remarkable about this case is not the severity of the crimes, though they are serious. What is remarkable is the courage of a 3-year-old child who was willing to bear witness to violence, to testify about what she had seen, and to speak truth in the face of sophisticated legal efforts to make her doubt her own perception. That child's testimony, along with the physical evidence, has established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Justice has been served through the jury's verdict. Judge Harrison continued, outlining the legal factors that guided sentencing, the nature of the crime, the victim's impact, the defendant's prior criminal history, and the likelihood of future danger to society. All of these factors weighed heavily toward a substantial sentence. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections, Judge Harrison announced. This sentence will be served without the possibility of parole. You will be credited with time served since your arrest. You have the right to appeal this sentence within 30 days. This court adjourns. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Marcus Webb's face flushed with rage, and he lunged against his shackles, obscenities pouring from his mouth. Court officers moved quickly to restrain him and remove him from the courtroom. Within minutes, the dramatic tension of the sentencing hearing had dissipated, and the courtroom began to empty. But before Emma and her family could leave, something unprecedented happened. Judge Harrison, breaking protocol in a way that he would likely never do again, requested that Emma be brought to the bench. The judge, understanding the profound significance of what this child had accomplished, wanted to acknowledge her bravery in a manner that would be recorded in the official record of the case. Sarah carried Emma to the judge's bench, and Emma found herself looking up at Judge Harrison, this intimidating man who had presided over the entire process with stern authority. The judge looked down at Emma with an expression of genuine warmth and respect. "Emma, I want you to know something," Judge Harrison said, his voice taking on a gentleness that seemed to surprise those present who had only ever heard him in his formal judicial capacity. "You did something very difficult. You told the truth, even when it was scary, even when someone tried to make you doubt yourself. Because you were brave, justice was served. Because you spoke up, another person will not be hurt by the man who hurt your neighbor. You are a very special girl, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you." Emma, overwhelmed by the judge's words and the significance of the moment, did what seemed most natural. She pointed toward Max, who had been brought closer to the bench by Officer Patterson. "Good dog," Emma said simply, repeating the words that had changed everything. Judge Harrison laughed, a genuine warm sound that seemed to humanize the formal setting. "Yes, Emma, good dog indeed. Very good dog." Officer Patterson guided Max even closer to the bench, and Emma was able to embrace her four-legged companion while Judge Harrison looked on. The moment was photographed by courtroom observers, and it became the iconic image of the case. A small girl hugging a large German shepherd while a judge smiled down at them both. A visual representation of the profound ways that unconditional presence can support human beings through their darkest moments. In the weeks and months following sentencing, the story of Emma and Max spread far beyond Arizona. Legal journals published detailed analyses of how the comfort dog's presence had rehabilitated a traumatized child witness's testimony. Universities began developing specialized training programs for what came to be known as trauma-responsive courtroom animals. Mental health professionals cited the case as evidence of the therapeutic power of animal-assisted intervention in supporting trauma recovery. But perhaps most significantly, Arizona passed legislation, eventually named the Emma Protocol, that mandated the availability of certified comfort animals for child witnesses in cases involving traumatic crimes. The legislation ensured that other children facing similar circumstances would have access to the same kind of support that had transformed Emma's experience. Within 3 years, 17 other states had passed similar legislation, all directly inspired by Emma's case and the remarkable moment when a 3-year-old girl's simple words, "Good dog," had changed the trajectory of a criminal trial and ultimately the legal system itself. Years later, when Emma was 10 years old, she attended a special ceremony at the courthouse where Max was honored for his service to the justice system. Emma stood beside her four-legged friend, her hand resting on his shoulder, and they were photographed together, an image that would be used in training materials for victim advocates, in courtroom procedure manuals, and in countless presentations about trauma-informed justice practices. Emma never forgot the cold courtroom, the scary questions, or the moment when her confidence had been attacked and undermined. But she also never forgot the warmth of Max's presence, the clarity that had come when she recognized the difference between good and evil, and the way that trust, once found, could transform everything. The impact of Emma's testimony extended far beyond the legal conviction of Marcus Webb. Her case became a turning point in how the criminal justice system understood and supported child witnesses. Training protocols changed. Courtroom procedures evolved. Judicial attitudes shifted toward a greater recognition of the vulnerabilities of child witnesses and the importance of providing appropriate support systems. Emma's mother, Sarah, became an advocate for trauma-informed justice, giving speeches and writing articles about her daughter's experience and the ways that proper support could enable children to access their own truth, even in the face of sophisticated legal challenges. Emma herself grew up understanding that her small voice, supported by the presence of a dog who had recognized her fear and responded with unconditional acceptance, had changed the world in subtle but profound ways. She became passionate about animal-assisted therapy, and eventually, as an adult, she pursued a career working with traumatized children and their families, incorporating animal-assisted intervention into her therapeutic practice. Max continued his work as a courthouse comfort animal for another 6 years before retiring at the age of 11. Officer Patterson cared for the aging dog in his own home, ensuring that Max's final years were filled with the same warmth and security that he had provided to Emma and dozens of other traumatized children. When Max eventually passed away, obituaries appeared in newspapers across Arizona, tributes to a dog who had understood, through some combination of training and innate wisdom, that his presence mattered, that his constancy and acceptance could help heal wounds that adult words and legal strategies sometimes struggled to address. The courtroom where Emma had testified was eventually renovated and expanded, and in the new design, provision was made for comfort animals to have their own designated space, a testament to the fundamental change that one small girl and one good dog had inspired. The room became known informally among court staff as Emma's Courtroom, a space designed with the understanding that justice was not merely about rules and procedures, but about supporting human beings through their most difficult moments of truth-telling. Emma never lost her connection to Max, and when the dog passed away, she felt the loss as acutely as if she had lost a human family member. At his memorial service, attended by Officer Patterson, Emma's family, and numerous court officials and legal professionals whose lives had been touched by Max's story, Emma delivered a brief eulogy. "Max taught me that good is real," Emma said, her voice stronger and clearer than it had been when she was 3 years old. "He taught me that I could trust my own ability to know the difference between safe and unsafe, between kind and cruel. He taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing someone can do is just be present, just show up, just believe in you." Max didn't solve anything with words. He solved everything by being good. I'll never forget him. As Emma's words echoed through the memorial service, those present understood that they were witnessing not just a tribute to a dog, but a reflection on the profound impact that unconditional presence and support can have on human healing and justice. The story of Emma and Max had become more than a legal case. It had become a parable about the nature of truth, courage, and the transformative power of genuine compassion. In a world that often seemed cold and incomprehensible, Emma and Max had demonstrated that goodness was real, that truth could prevail, and that sometimes the smallest voices, supported by the most faithful presence, could change everything.